Solar City was the kind of place where the rich never looked down and the poor never looked up. Suspended bridges gleamed with translucent glass, weaving between silver towers that seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. At night, the neon glow of advertising screens washed the skyline in shimmering hues, promising luxury, adventure, and endless opportunity. But if you descended from the lev trains and shining platforms into the alleyways that the city planners pretended didn't exist, the air turned acrid with refuse and the smell of desperation. It was here, among the shadows of a city that had forgotten her, that the alien girl survived. Her name was Lyra, though almost no one ever used it. To most passers-by, she was just stray refugee, or worse. Her skin carried a faint shimmer, an iridescent quality that caught light in ways no human complexion could. In the darkness, it glowed faintly, betraying her whenever she tried to hide. Her large, pupilless eyes reflected the world like black mirrors. To many Solar citizens, that was enough to mark her as alien, as other, as unwanted. Lyra had been on the streets for nearly 5 years, though her actual age was difficult to guess. Her species matured differently than humans, but she looked young, perhaps 14 by human measure. The war that had ripped through her home system had scattered millions of her people. Some made it to refugee camps. Others, like Lyra, slipped through the cracks and landed in cities where no one wanted to see them. Every morning she woke curled beneath the skeleton of a broken transit terminal, her thin blanket wrapped around her like a cocoon. Hunger gnawed at her constantly. She scavenged from trash chutes, sometimes bartered odd jobs for scraps of food, sometimes begged. She had learned to walk quickly, keep her head down, and avoid both the police and gangs who preyed on the weak. And yet, despite it all, she clung stubbornly to a principle that seemed absurd in a place like Solara's underbelly. She did not steal. Lyra had been told once, long ago by her mother, that integrity was the one possession no war, no hunger, no cruelty could strip away. That phrase became the last memory she held of her family, and she guarded it as fiercely as her life. That day began like any other. The mid-level plazas were busy with traders and off-world merchants. Lyra stayed close to the crowd, hoping the smell of roasted meat skewers and fresh bread would distract her stomach long enough to keep her from collapsing. She was debating whether to risk slipping into the service corridor of a bakery when she noticed him. The man was human, dressed in the tailored black coat of a diplomat. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone used to power. His silver pin gleamed on his lapel, the emblem of the Terran Diplomatic Corps. Even the crowd gave him space as he passed, his 2 aides and security detail trailing behind. He had just finished a formal luncheon at one of the elite restaurants that sat above the plaza like jewels perched on steel branches. Lyra's eyes followed him, more out of instinct than intent. That was when she saw it. The slight slip of leather from his coat pocket, falling unnoticed to the ground. The crowd swallowed him as he continued on, but the object lay there, untouched. She bent down quickly, her fingers closing around it. A wallet, not the cheap digital kind most street dwellers carried, but a heavy one, real leather, smooth and polished. Inside, she glimpsed a glint of identification cards, embossed seals, and rows of credit chips. The weight of it in her hand was staggering. Her first thought was survival. This wallet could buy her food for months, perhaps even away off the streets. She could trade the diplomatic credentials to the gangs for protection. For a single moment, her heart raced with temptation. But then her mother's words echoed again. Integrity is the one possession no one can take from you. Lyra's hand trembled. She closed the wallet, pressing it against her chest. She knew what she had to do. The Terran embassy loomed several blocks away, guarded by armored gates and security scanners. Just the idea of walking up to it filled her with dread. She had been chased away from those gates before, told aliens like her had no business there. But this time, she had a reason. With hesitant steps, Lyra began to walk toward the embassy, clutching the wallet as though it might vanish. Each step was a battle with doubt. What if they accused her of theft? What if they arrested her? But still she walked, weaving through the crowd, her ragged boots scraping the plaza tiles. By the time she reached the embassy gates, the sun had dipped low, painting the towers in copper light. The guard stiffened as she approached. "State your business," one barked, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. Lyra swallowed hard, holding the wallet out with both hands. "This belongs to your diplomat." He dropped it. The guard frowned, suspicious. Another leaned closer, scanning her alien features with disdain. "Where'd you get this?" "I told you," Lyra said quietly, her voice almost breaking. He dropped it. "I picked it up. Nothing is missing." For a long moment, they stared at her as if she were trying to trick them. Then one finally snatched the wallet from her hands. "Wait here," he said curtly. Lyra stood frozen, her heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay. Minutes stretched like hours. The guards whispered to each other, casting her wary glances. At last, the embassy doors opened, and a tall man stepped out, the same diplomat she had seen in the plaza. His eyes landed on her immediately, and that was the moment everything changed. Ambassador Elias Varon had the look of a man who belonged anywhere but here. His hair was streaked with premature gray, cut short with diplomatic precision. His uniform, a sleek black coat adorned with silver threads of the Terran emblem, was immaculate even after a long day of negotiations. Yet his face betrayed fatigue, the kind that came not just from politics, but from years of seeing the galaxy at its ugliest. When the guard pressed the wallet into his hand, Elias frowned. He hadn't even noticed it was gone. Inside were his identification cards, access permits, and, most dangerously, coded diplomatic keys. Losing it should have been a scandal. That it had returned to him, intact, was nothing short of a miracle. "Who brought this?" he asked sharply. The guard tilted his chin toward the figure, standing stiffly at the edge of the gate. Elias followed his gaze and saw her. A thin alien girl in threadbare clothes, standing with her hands clenched at her sides. Her wide black eyes reflected the embassy lights like pools of obsidian. The guard sneered. "Caught her trying to hand it over. Claims you dropped it." Elias studied her closely. He was used to deception, to cons and thieves who saw diplomats as easy prey. Yet something about her posture struck him. She did not plead or beg. She did not look away. She simply stood there, as though daring him to see the truth. "Bring her inside," Elias ordered. The guards exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered, "Sir, that's not—" "I said," Elias repeated, his voice firm, "bring her inside." Reluctantly, they obeyed. Lyra's heart pounded as she was escorted through the embassy gates. She had expected suspicion, maybe even to be arrested. What she hadn't expected was to find herself standing in the polished marble foyer of the Terran embassy, where humans in tailored uniforms paused to stare at her as though she were an intruder in a sacred temple. Elias dismissed the guards and stepped closer. He held up the wallet. "You found this?" Lyra nodded silently. "You didn't take anything?" "No." Her voice was small but steady. It was heavy with credits. "I didn't touch them." He opened the wallet, scanned through its contents. Everything was intact. His gaze softened, though his tone remained careful. "Why return it? You could have kept it, sold it, fed yourself for months." Lyra shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny. Her hands tightened into fists. "Because it wasn't mine." The simplicity of the statement struck Elias harder than he expected. In a city where corruption was common, where even seasoned politicians bent rules for profit, this girl, ragged, hungry alien, had chosen honesty. "What is your name?" he asked. "Lyra." "Where are your parents, Lyra?" Her lips pressed together, and for a long moment she didn't answer. Then she whispered, "Gone." The word carried more weight than any speech Elias had heard in a Senate chamber. He exhaled slowly, considering. By all rights, he should have thanked her, dismissed her, and gone on with his evening. Diplomats were discouraged from personal entanglements, especially with refugees. Every instinct told him to keep the boundary firm. Yet something in Lyra's eyes, the quiet dignity, the flicker of defiance, held him. "Have you eaten today?" he asked abruptly. Lyra blinked, startled by the question. "No." Elias gestured to a waiting aide. "Bring food. Something warm." The aide hesitated. "Sir." "Now!" Elias snapped. Minutes later, Lyra sat at a small embassy table, with a steaming bowl of stew before her. She ate cautiously at first, then hungrily, though she tried to maintain some restraint as Elias watched. He did not interrupt, letting her eat until she slowed. When at last she pushed the bowl away, he asked, "How long have you lived on the streets?" 5 years. And no one helped you? Her black eyes glistened, but she refused to let tears fall. People don't help my kind. We are in the way. Elias leaned back, his expression unreadable. He had spent his career arguing treaties, balancing trade agreements, navigating interspecies hostility. Yet here, sitting across from one displaced child, the failures of galactic diplomacy became painfully clear. "You did the right thing," he said finally, "and I will not forget that." Lyra tilted her head, uncertain. "You mean you're not going to throw me out?" Elias gave a weary half-smile. "On the contrary, I think this city has thrown you out enough." The word stunned her. She stared at him, hardly able to believe. People did not talk to her this way. People did not see her this way. A silence settled between them, not heavy but profound. For the first time in years, Lyra felt not like a shadow, not like a nuisance, but like someone who mattered. What Elias decided next would ripple far beyond that embassy hall. But in that moment, neither he nor Lyra knew just how much their lives, and the galaxy's perception of what compassion meant, were about to change. Ambassador Elias Varen was not a man given to rash impulses. Every decision he made was usually measured, calculated for its diplomatic weight. But that evening, when Lyra finished her stew and tried to shrink back into the shadows of the embassy foyer, he felt a conviction he had not felt in years. "Lyra," he said firmly, "you are not going back to the streets." The girl froze, her eyes widening. "But I don't belong here." Elias shook his head. "You returned something that could have changed your life. You chose honesty when survival tempted you otherwise. That tells me you deserve more than the gut of this city has forced you into." His words carried a weight Lyra didn't fully understand, but she heard sincerity in them. For the first time in so long, someone spoke to her as though her worth wasn't defined by the raggedness of her clothes or the alien hue of her skin. First steps toward change. The next morning, Elias summoned his senior aides. They gathered around the long conference table, datapads in hand, expecting another briefing on interstellar trade tariffs. Instead, Elias placed Lyra before them. "This girl will be staying under our protection," he announced. Effective immediately. The aides exchanged uneasy glances. One cleared his throat. "With respect, Ambassador, that's highly irregular. Our charter doesn't." "Our charter," Elias cut in, his voice firm, "says we represent not only Earth's interests, but also the values of justice and dignity. Tell me, which of those values is upheld when a child lives on our streets, starving while we debate policies inside these walls?" The aide faltered, caught off guard. But another, older staffer leaned forward. "Sir, if this becomes public, it will be seen as favoritism or worse, a liability. There are factions already critical of our refugee stance." Elias glanced at Lyra, who stood silently, staring at the floor, trying to make herself small. His jaw tightened. "Let them criticize," he said coldly. "I will not send her back outside these gates." And with that, the matter was settled. Within hours, embassy staff arranged a small room for her, barely more than a cot and a desk, but to Lyra it was palatial compared to cold concrete. They brought her fresh clothes, proper meals, and medical attention. At first, she resisted, unaccustomed to kindness. The warm food made her stomach ache. The softness of the bed felt unearned. She clung to her old blanket, the last remnant of her past life, even as she buried herself under clean sheets. But slowly, tentatively, she began to accept it, resistance and backlash. News travels fast in Solar City, faster than light sometimes. Within days, rumors spread. The human ambassador had taken in an alien street urchin. Some tabloids painted the act as scandalous, accusing Elias of weakness or secret dealings. Politicians from rival delegations whispered about impropriety, questioning whether she was a spy. The embassy received angry letters, even threats. "Our diplomats should be protecting our borders, not sheltering alien beggars." One message read. Elias read them all with a grim smile, then forwarded them to a folder labeled Noise. He had dealt with worse storms in the political arena. What mattered was not their outrage, but the fact that Lyra now slept safely for the first time in years. Still, he knew the backlash could not be ignored forever. His position depended on results, and his every move was scrutinized. By choosing Lyra, he had tied his reputation to hers. Lyra's transformation begins. Despite the outside hostility, Lyra began to change within the walls of the embassy. She learned to read Terran's standard properly, guided by a patient aide who brought her storybooks. At first, she stumbled over the words, embarrassed by her mistakes, but soon she devoured pages late into the night, her eyes glowing faintly as they scanned the text. She began attending lessons with other children of embassy staff. At first, they whispered, some mocked her alien features. But Lyra's quiet intelligence and determination surprised them. She absorbed knowledge quickly, especially in sciences. Her people's natural affinity for energy manipulation, making complex concepts intuitive. Yet trauma lingered. Some nights she woke screaming, memories of war and hunger clawing through her dreams. On those nights, Elias sometimes found her curled in the corner of her room, clutching her old blanket like armor. He never pressed her for details. He simply sat nearby, a silent reassurance until she calmed. Gradually, trust blossomed. She began to speak more openly, not just about her survival on the streets, but about her people, her home system, the little fragments of joy she remembered before war. Elias listened, always attentive, realizing he was learning more from her stories than from any diplomatic briefing. Symbol of hope. Word of Lyra's honesty and the ambassador's response began to spread beyond the walls of political gossip. Refugee communities whispered of the alien girl, who returned the diplomat's wallet and was taken in instead of cast out. To them, her story was not scandal, it was hope. Non-profits and aid groups began citing her example, lobbying for broader programs to help displaced children. Other diplomats, seeing Elias's bold stance, hesitated at first but then followed suit, sponsoring small initiatives. Lyra became a quiet symbol, though she herself did not seek attention. To her, it was enough to no longer starve, to finally feel seen. But every time someone approached her in a market or on embassy grounds, thanking her for her honesty, she realized her choice in that moment at the plaza had rippled farther than she could imagine, a bond beyond duty. For Elias, what had begun as an act of gratitude evolved into something deeper. He visited her room often, not as an ambassador checking on a ward, but as a mentor. He brought her books from his own collection, shared stories of Earth's history, even taught her old Terran sayings. One evening, after Lyra successfully completed her first set of formal studies, he told her, "You remind me of why I became a diplomat, not for treaties or titles, but for people, for giving voices to those ignored." Lyra looked at him with wide, luminous eyes. "And you remind me that not all humans hate us." It was a simple exchange, but for both of them it was transformative. By the end of that year, Lyra was no longer the trembling street girl who had clutched a lost wallet. She was healthier, educated, and beginning to glimpse a future she had never dared dream of. Yet with her growth came new challenges. Attention from those who wanted to use her story for their own ends, and resistance from powerful voices who saw her as a threat to their order. The kindness that had begun with a single return wallet was about to ignite consequences neither she nor Elias could have foreseen. The story of the alien girl who had returned the diplomat's wallet should have been a footnote in the endless tide of interstellar politics. Yet, like all things rooted in truth and compassion, it spread faster than the cynics could contain. By the second year of Lyra's life under the Terran Embassy's care, her name was whispered not just in Solar City's alleys, but in council chambers light years away. Politicians argued over her significance. Was she a symbol of Terran propaganda, or a genuine spark of hope? Charities cited her case in appeals for funding. Even rival diplomats who had mocked Ambassador Elias Vera now found themselves pressured to answer the question. If a starving street child could show honesty, why couldn't their governments show humanity? The summit invitation. The true turning point came when the Galactic Council announced its annual summit. Delegations from dozens of species gathered each year to debate treaties and flaunt power. Normally, the event was tightly scripted, a theater of diplomacy. But that year, to the shock of many, Elias petitioned for Lyra to attend as a guest. His argument was simple. If the galaxy was to debate the future of refugees and displaced populations, why not hear directly from one who had lived it? The request sent shockwaves through political circles. Many objected fiercely. An alien street orphan has no place in the halls of governance. One senator from the Dravoni League scoffed. This is a stunt. Others warned it set a dangerous precedent. Yet, after weeks of fierce debate, the council granted the request. Perhaps they thought her presence would be harmless. Perhaps they underestimated the power of a single story, the speech. The summit chamber was a cathedral of glass and steel, lit by the glow of distant stars through massive windows. Delegates sat in tiered rows, their robes and insignias glittering like a living mosaic. When Lyra stepped onto the central platform, a hush fell over the chamber. She wore simple robes, not ornate, not political, but dignified. Her shimmering skin caught the light, her black eyes reflecting the faces of hundreds who stared down at her. For a moment, the weight of the galaxy seemed to press against her chest. She remembered the alleys, the hunger, the fear. She remembered the guard's suspicion, the whispers of mockery. And she remembered the moment she chose not to steal, the moment her life had shifted. Her voice trembled at first, but then grew stronger. I am not a senator. I am not a diplomat. I am just one girl who once slept on cold stone and wondered if the galaxy cared whether I lived another day. Murmurs rippled through the chamber, but she pressed on. I had nothing, and yet, when I found what was not mine, I chose to return it. Not because I hoped for reward, but because my mother once told me that integrity is the one possession no one can take from you. That choice changed my life, but it also changed others. It proved that even the smallest act of honesty can be seen, can matter, can ripple across stars. Her words struck the chamber with a force no declaration of trade or security pact ever had. Delegates leaned forward, some with shame, others with awe. Lyra's eyes swept across them. You debate policies about people like me, refugees, the displaced, the forgotten, as if we are statistics. But we are lives. We are voices. All we need is a chance. All we need is to be seen as Ambassador Varen saw me. Silence followed her final words, deep and resonant. Then, to the astonishment of many, applause began, not from one block or species, but scattered throughout the chamber, growing into a wave. The aftermath. News networks broadcast her speech across the galaxy. Clips of the shimmering-eyed girl standing against the most powerful beings in known space flooded every screen. Commentators debated endlessly. Was she a political pawn or a genuine voice of change? But for countless ordinary people, especially refugees and marginalized groups, her words were not politics. They were validation. For once, someone who had lived their struggle stood in the heart of power and spoke truth. New initiatives sprang up almost overnight. Refugee education programs doubled in funding. Governments once hostile to aid began to shift under public pressure. Even rival diplomats found themselves compelled to support reforms, if only to avoid looking callous in comparison. Elias Varen, once criticized for his reckless charity, became lauded as a visionary, but he deflected praise, always pointing back to Lyra. She is not my creation, he told reporters. She is her own strength, her own courage. I simply refuse to look away. A bond forged in integrity. Behind the grand speeches and political ripples, the bond between Lyra and Elias deepened. He continued to mentor her, but increasingly, he also listened to her. She had lived truths no diplomat had, and her insights reshaped the way he approached negotiations. One evening, after the summit, Lyra asked him softly, "Why did you believe me? That first night? Why didn't you think I had stolen it?" Elias smiled faintly. "Because when I looked at you, I saw eyes that had nothing left to lose, and still chose honesty. That's rarer than any treaty I've ever signed." Lyra considered his words, then whispered, "You gave me back more than safety. You gave me back the chance to believe I mattered." He placed a hand on her shoulder. And you reminded me why I became a diplomat in the first place. The galaxy stunned. In the months that followed, Lyra's role grew. She was invited to councils, schools, and communities, not as a politician, but as a living story. Wherever she went, she carried the same message. Dignity was not a privilege, but a right. To some, she was still just an alien girl from the streets. But to many more, she became something greater, a symbol that honesty, compassion, and courage could cut to the cold machinery of galactic politics. The galaxy had been stunned not by the wallet, nor even by the ambassador's act, but by what followed. A chain of events proving that even the smallest choice, the quietest integrity, could alter the course of countless lives. And in the quiet moments, when she thought back to that day in the plaza, Lyra often wondered what her mother would say if she could see her now. Perhaps she would smile, proud that her daughter had carried her words farther than either of them could have dreamed. Closing reflection. She had once been invisible, a shadow drifting through alleys. But by returning what was not hers, she had found everything she had been missing: safety, belonging, purpose. And for Elias Varen, what had begun as a lost wallet became the greatest diplomatic victory of his career. Not because it won him power, but because it reminded an entire galaxy that integrity still mattered. The stunned galaxy would not soon forget. She had returned a lost wallet. What humanity gained in return was far greater than credits. It was hope reborn,